So welcome everyone. My name is Irina Levin. I'm the director of the Critical Languages Institute and also officially associate director of the Melikian Center. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're here to listen to a presentation by Dr. Nicholas Danforth, who whose work on Turkey I've been following for many years, who's written about Turkey both kind of for the academic audience and a broader audience in outlets such as Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic, the New York Times. And today he is going to be talking about Turkey and Russia. And we're very excited to hear what he has to say. So Nick, please take it away.
All right, thank you so much. Let me switch to my PowerPoint slide. Did that work?
Yes.
Excellent. Yes, Turkey and Russia, beyond the myth of historical enmity. The starting point for my presentation today, and I should say this is based on a research project I'm doing at the Woodrow Wilson Institute's Kennan Center right now. I think so long as they're giving me money, I'm required to say that before everything I say on Turkish-Russian relations. They are indirectly sponsoring this. Yeah, they get their plug here. The starting point for this is that as Turkish-Russian relations have been going through a somewhat chaotic series of reconfigurations over the past several years, it's become clear that the historical narrative people often refer to in trying to explain and trying to give a backdrop for Turkish-Russian relations is inadequate. And as is always the case, as our version of history no longer fits or explains current events, we go back and we try to rewrite history so that it matches what's going on today. And in that spirit, this will be an effort to provide a slightly different or more nuanced or more helpful perspective on the history of Turkish-Russian relations, which, again, goes beyond the idea that they are simply historical enemies, and therefore gives us a little more perspective on what's happening now. So, Turkey and Russia indeed have fought many wars throughout their history. This has been a staple of articles that have been written on the subject of Turkish-Russian relations for at least 70 years. The first quote here is from the Cold War. The second two quotes the first quote here is actually from 1949, something the Turkish foreign minister wrote in Foreign Affairs at the time. The second two quotes are recent articles about Turkish-Russian relations. And again, depending on how you count, usually it's 12 wars, 7 wars in the course of 2.5 centuries. You can tally it up, but indeed, there have been a number of wars throughout Russian-Turkish history. This is very true. The question, when this is raised, is what does it mean? During the Cold War, this became a favorite talking point for people in both Washington and the United States because it offered a convenient explanation for Turkey's membership in NATO. Turkey's been a member of NATO since 1942. It's been a US ally since shortly after the Cold War. For both Turkish and American policymakers, this centuries-long history of Russian-Turkish rivalry was an excellent talking point to explain Turkey's commitment to NATO, the importance of the alliance to Turkey, to convince an American audience that Turkey was a good partner in NATO. And I guess I'd also say in the early 90s, as the relevance of NATO kind of broke down, this talking point wasn't necessarily needed. But in the last decade or so, as there's been more concern in Washington about Russia, and as Turkish-Russian relations have developed, and people have been trying to understand it, this talking point about the historic Russian-Turkish enmity has come up again. And when it's raised, there's a potentially contradictory way in which it is cited. It either serves as evidence that the current Russian-Turkish rapprochement, which we've seen since 2016, is somehow unnatural, is short-lived, is destined to break down, is not something people should worry about. Or conversely, for people who want to worry about it, for people who want to get American policymakers worked up about the prospects of improved Turkish-Russian relations, the history is evidence of what a massive geopolitical shift this is. That for centuries, Turkey has been Russia's enemy. Now, because of the tumultuous period we're going through in the world, now because of Erdogan's realignment of Turkey's priorities, for the first time in centuries, Turkey has become Russia's ally, and this represents an epic geopolitical realignment. Not surprisingly, what I'm here to say today is that the actual history is more complicated. And we can, much as the idea of centuries of Russian-Turkish conflict is an oversimplification, we can offer a still stylized, but I think more nuanced history of Russian-Turkish relations in which the present moment actually fits quite well. Which is to say that, again, the history of antagonism is quite clear. However, within that history, at moments when Turkey did not see Russia as a threat, or saw a greater threat coming from somewhere else, often the West, Turkey was often eager to improve relations with Russia or the Soviet Union, and Russia and the Soviet Union was often eager to reciprocate. So to go all the way back to the 19th century, and then we'll skip ahead quickly, the first real modern example of this is in the 1830s, when the Egyptian government under Muhammad Ali, which had been part of the Ottoman Empire, then became a independent, still nominally suzerain, but basically independent territory with a newly modernized army, decided that the Pasha of Egypt decided that he would take the opportunity to actually conquer the Ottoman Empire and install himself as Sultan. Instead of settling for Egypt, he'd get the whole thing. He invaded the Ottoman Empire. First, he took Syria. He was marching on Istanbul. The British and French, which had had a longstanding policy of supporting the Ottoman Empire against Russia, were busy with other things, were frustrated with the Sultan for various reasons, thought perhaps they had an opportunity in letting the Egyptians take Istanbul. They didn't do anything, and the Ottomans, in a dramatic turn of face, actually invited Russian soldiers, 20 to 40,000 Russian troops, to land in Istanbul and actually defend the capital from advancing Egyptian forces. This move was, from the Ottoman perspective, quite effective. In the short term, it prevented the Egyptians from marching on Istanbul. It also sufficiently worried the French and British that they decided it was time for them to do something. They regretted having abandoned the Ottoman Empire to its fate, and they proceeded to provide the military support that the Ottomans wanted against the Egyptians, at which point the Ottomans were happy to ask the Russian forces to leave. This, skipping ahead a century, leaving some stuff out, you can see another example of something very similar to this happening in the immediate aftermath of World War I. World War I, another conflict between Turkey and Russia, a very violent one. But at the end of it, when Turkey is occupied by victorious Allied powers, France, England, Italy, later Greece, and Mustafa Kemal Atatürk is waging a desperate war of defense to try to retake Anatolia. The Russians, which have obviously been through some things during this period as well, are no longer the major empire they were at the start of World War I, suddenly see that they have a common cause with the, at this point, Ottoman/Turkish nationalists, and they actually provide a remarkable amount of assistance, both direct military assistance and economic assistance to Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's nationalist movement as it's waging what the Turks call the War of Independence against foreign imperial powers. This conflict ends with Turkey having established its independence, but still feeling very much threatened. The British are in Iraq, the French are in Syria, the Italians have colonies in the Dodecanese Islands, Turkey still very much feels like it's surrounded by hostile Western powers and feels like the main threat that it faces is from, again, remains from England and France and Italy. In this context, the Soviet Union, again, remains a very, the Soviet Union having nominally rejected its imperial past, remains a source of financial and military support for Ataturk, as well as, I think, and there's some excellent work on this that we can talk about later, a source of inspiration. There's a real ideological affinity that goes beyond the pragmatic bond that these two countries share. And that, you know, the Turkish government is as a non-Western power that's trying to industrialize very quickly, willing to look to the Soviets for advice on that. Turkey actually implements 2 5-year plans in the 20s and the 30s. And when you see visiting Russian or Soviet ambassadors, they're often very eager to invoke the rhetoric of anti-imperialism, invoke this shared anti-imperial struggle in discussing the bond that they have with Turkey. They're both countries that feel like they were initially ill-served by the settlement that came out of World War I, ill-served by the realignment of the world after World War I. And, you know, in this case, Turkey stands as a successful example of having challenged the victorious Allied powers, which at some level the Russians also see as an inspiration. No, this actually works very well up until the 30s, when, for various reasons, Turkey gets more worried about Italy. And first, this is actually something that gives, again, the Turkey and Russia more of a common cause. The part of the reason that Turkey is able to negotiate the Montreux Convention, the new regime to govern the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, is because Russia is also to some extent worried about the Italian threat in the Mediterranean. And so is England. And this gives Russia, Turkey, and England an odd alignment of common interests against the Italians, which result in the British, Russians, and Turkish coming together, renegotiating the Montreux Convention, giving Turkey control of the Bosporus, at which point Russia starts getting worried that England and Turkey are actually getting too close. And from Russia's point of view, starting in 1936, there's a fear that Turkey is reverting to its pre-war 19th century foreign policy of using ties with England to restrain, constrain, check Russian influence in the region. This results in Russia being increasingly less accommodating of Turkey, Russia dragging its feet when it comes to renewing friendship agreements with Turkey, the Turks getting a feeling that Russia is viewing them much more coldly, and from Turkey's point of view, a reemergence of, first in the late 1930s, a reemergence of the intellectual fears, the memory of the Russian threat that existed before. This takes its most dramatic manifestation after the end of World War II, when suddenly you have not just Turkey's concerns about Russia, which have been growing since 1936, take on a new life. But you also have Russia very concerned about the role that Turkey played during World War II, making accusations that Turkey allowed Nazi ships to transit through the Bosporus during the war, upset that Turkey remained neutral. Turkey signs an agreement with the Nazis immediately on the eve of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Russia, in short, has begun to see Turkey as a hostile power. Turkey, is not only seeing Russia as a hostile power, but is also seeing the dramatic expansion of Russian power in Eastern Europe. So independent of whether they think Russia is threatening them, they see a much more dramatic Russian threat. Famously, when Turkey goes to renew its friendship agreement with Russia after World War II, Russia refuses. And then Stalin famously makes demands for Soviet bases on the Bosporus, renegotiating the Treaty of Montreux. And then unofficially off the record, but still worrying enough from Turkey's point of view, suggests that maybe Turkey would consider some territorial rectifications in eastern Anatolia, basically giving Russia back territory that had been occupied in 1878 after the Russo-Turkish War then. This causes enormous alarm in Ankara, causes enormous alarm in Washington, leads to Turkey joining NATO, and is enough to make Turkey, the memory of this moment, the sense that this is what Russian foreign policy would be if Turkey did not have powerful protectors, lasts throughout the Cold War. Even after, it's worth noting, once Khrushchev comes to power, he apologizes for and renounces Stalin's post-war suggestions. But again, this in itself isn't enough to alleviate Turkish suspicions. However, what happens at this time, as soon as Turkey has joined NATO, and as soon as Turkey's NATO membership becomes a pillar of its foreign policy orientation, this, ironically, in a sense, means that for even more so than in the 19th century in some extent, Turkey doesn't see Russia as a direct threat anymore. Turkey sees Russia as a long-term threat. Turkey remains convinced that if it weren't part of NATO, Russia would become a threat again. But on a day-to-day basis, it's not worried about Russian troops pouring over the border. And this enables a period of sporadic Cold War outreach, where a series of Turkish politicians who come to power from the 60s through the 80s, when they get frustrated with the United States, when they get frustrated with NATO, are eager to turn to the Soviet Union, sometimes as a cynical diplomatic maneuver, but sometimes with a real sense of optimism to see what concessions they can get. And in some cases, they succeed in getting real Russian, if nothing else, economic support. Russia helps build a coal factory in northwest Turkey. Russia builds, I think, a glass factory in southern Turkey in the 60s. And this, interestingly enough, happens under both right-wing and left-wing Turkish foreign ministers, Turkish prime ministers. The United States gets a little more worried when left-wing prime ministers do it, but right-wing prime ministers are often very eager to make the same ploy of outreach to Russia and can be equally effective. It's also worth noting when, after the invasion of Cyprus in 1974, the United States imposes an arms embargo, but the United States Congress imposes an arms embargo on Turkey. The CIA helps undermine it. But at the end of the day, it's enough to convince Turkey that it needs alternate sources of military support. And Turkey's on the verge of reaching an arrangement to start buying weapons from the Eastern Bloc in 1978 when the arms embargo was lifted. So some of the stuff we're seeing today with Turkey getting angry at the United States and offering to buy Russian, or in this case, buying Russian weapons, is not unprecedented. This leads us to the final step, this leads us to what's going on today, which is that after the end of the Cold War, obviously Turkey did not see Russia as a threat in the same way that it used to. In that, initially, going back to the early 90s, it led many people to predict that you would see a weakening of Turkey's ties with NATO and a very rapid improvement of Turkish-Russian relations. And in the 90s, this actually didn't happen. And by the end of the 90s, as Turkey remained a very loyal, enthusiastic NATO member, some of these predictions began to seem a little bit foolhardy. And yeah, I think you can say that what's happening today in some ways is a long-term result of the geopolitical opportunities that opened up at the end of the Cold War. Through the 90s, there was no direct points of friction between Turkey and the West, between Turkey and the United States. And so there was no strain at Turkey-NATO or Turkey-American ties. However, as that strain developed, you didn't have the Soviet Union as a unifying threat to keep the United States and Turkey on the same side. And so as a result, you had Turkey now able to go much further in the kind of outreach that it hinted at or it played around with during the Cold War. And depending on what people's interests are, we can talk a lot more about what's going on right now. The final point to make here is that amongst all of these iterations, at least through the last century, the Kurdish question has always been central. And that Turkey's view of the Soviet Union and Turkey's view of the degree to which it perceived the Soviet Union as a threat vis-a-vis other countries was always shaped by how the Kurdish question was handled. In the late 19th century, through World War I, famously, Turkey was upset about Russian support for Armenian separatists, but there was also a great deal of concern about Russian support for Kurdish separatism, particularly in the early 20th century. At the end of World War I, suddenly it was the British that Turkey became paranoid were fueling Kurdish separatism. And so all the big Kurdish revolts that happened in Turkey, 1925, 1938, that Turkey is always convinced there's a secret British hand behind them, as there may have been in some cases, to be fair. And during this time, the Soviet Union was very careful, as part of its rapprochement with Turkey, not to give any support to Kurdish separatist actors. This changed, as this picture illustrates. After the end of World War II, you had the Soviet Union backing an independent Kurdish republic in northern Iran very briefly at the end of the war. And then you had the development of Kurdish separatists as a left-wing revolutionary movement, culminating, of course, with the PKK in the 1980s, viewed by Turkey as an existential threat, supported by the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. And this, in late Cold War Turkey, solidified the image of the Soviet Union as a much more direct existential threat than it even had been at earlier stages of the Cold War. And you could even say that through the 90s, some of this lingering perception of Russia as a PKK sponsor and the United States as Turkey's ally against the PKK was what helped keep the Cold War political alignment in place. Starting with the Iraq War, the first Iraq War, the Gulf War, and the United States backed no-fly zone, allowing a Kurdish, semi-independent Kurdish statelet autonomous region to emerge in northern Iraq, Turkish perception started to change. And it gradually became the United States that was associated with Kurdish separatism. This culminated in 2014, when you actually had Kurdish actors affiliated with the PKK who were fighting ISIS in Syria, receiving direct United States military support. And suddenly at this point, what had always been a conspiratorial assumption in Turkey's mind that the United States was backing PKK separatism became much more concrete and became a reality, and led to a dramatic reassessment of Turkey's geopolitical priorities. And indeed, one of the things that made the current moment of Turkish-Russian rapprochement possible, from Turkey's point of view necessary, I think, is that Russia controlled the airspace in Syria. Turkey wanted to intervene in Syria to prevent the growth of PKK-linked Kurdish political actors there that they saw as being American supported. And so Turkey ultimately decided in 2016 that making nice with Russia was the only way it was going to be able to achieve its interests vis-a-vis Kurdish separatism, to achieve, to protect its national interest, to protect what it sees as its as an existential matter, by gaining Russian support to defend itself against a threat which it sees as coming from, in this case, the United States and the European Union. So what I would argue is, in light of previous Turkish moves, most notably in the aftermath of World War I, when you have a moment in which all of a sudden Russia is not the direct military threat that it was in the 19th century or during the Cold War, and Turkey suddenly sees a much greater and more immediate threat coming from, then it was England and France, now it's the United States. Rapprochement with Russia is actually not at all surprising, and Unfortunately, this doesn't actually give us any good indication about how long-lasting it's going to be, other than to say that that will depend heavily on whether future Russian aggression in the region once again causes Ankara concern, or whether future US policies in the region make Ankara continue to be more scared of threats coming from the West than threats coming from the Northeast. So with that, I will end the prepared part of my talk, and happy to answer questions or discuss a little more the situation going on with Russia and Turkey today.
Sure. So Nick, do you want to keep that on, or do you want to just get back to our, regular Zoom view where we can sort of see each other? Up to you.
I'll just show my last slide in case it's not really that great. But at a recent summit between Erdogan and Putin, it was pointed out by many people that they'd somehow arranged it so the entire Turkish delegation was standing under a statue of Catherine the Great, which some people thought was an intentional move on Russia's point. Other people pointed out, even more cynically perhaps, that it would be hard to arrange a reception anywhere in Moscow where people weren't standing underneath a statue of someone who had defeated Turkey in battle at some point in history, because indeed they have fought many wars. But no, as long as everyone sees that picture, we can switch back to regular Zoom.
So as I wrote in our chat, Dr. Danforth is very happy to take questions, but with the amount of people we have present, what's easiest is if you would just type your question into the chat, and I'll let him know who the question is from, and he will do his best to answer it. So our first question, I feel like I kind of know the answer to, but I just want to hear how you get out of this one. Why do you use Russia when you're talking about the USSR?
Yes.
Clay, who's a faculty member in the School of Philosophical and Religious Studies at ASU. We like to have really long names here.
I have a very easy excuse for that. I am a historian. I try to stay close to my sources. All the Turkish and American diplomatic sources I've read from the 1950s use the terms interchangeably. Whether or not that is accurate, obviously, secondary question, but I've been so infected by my close association with the primary documents that have informed my study that I can't help slipping into some of that language at times.
Okay, that is a shockingly good answer, although be careful when you talk about being infected, all of us. Okay, so we have a question from, again, someone that you're already been in touch with over Twitter, Gary Grossman. He says he thinks that you're correct on all counts, which is impressive. And
that is not what most people on Twitter think, it turns out. They usually say the exact opposite.
Yeah, so he says, I see the myth as being used primarily to justify American foreign policy interests. You indicated that your more nuanced version may be helpful. And the question is, helpful to whom? Who benefits from nuance?
That is a good question. No, I mean, I definitely agree. It was very helpful to promote U.S. interests. I think it's also worth noting it was helpful to promote Turkish interests. Ironically, even at some of the moments when Turkey was trying to strategically make outreach to the Soviet Union, when the United States would call them on it, when the United States would seem too critical, the Turkish response would always be, don't worry, we fought 12 wars with the Soviet Union. You don't have to be concerned that we're leaving NATO. I mean, the challenge was they always wanted the United States to be just a little bit concerned. But if they thought the United States was getting too concerned, the historic myth also worked for Turkey to fall back on. No, I guess my hope, and I like the second part of this question, is that this is a sufficiently nuanced historical account that it could be useful for either side on this debate. It's funny to me that now, as people started worrying about the idea of Turkey turning east and making a pivot to Russia, people, whatever their view of what US policy towards Turkey should be, they were always able to invoke the same fear of Turkey's turn towards Russia to justify it. So for people who thought the United States had been too tough on Turkey, the United States should be more accommodating, should stop supporting the Syrian Kurds, should return Fethullah Gulen, the cleric who was involved in the Turkish coup attempt. For people who thought the United States the United States was threatening too many sanctions on Turkey, the response was always, if we keep being too hard on Turkey, if we keep threatening them, they're going to turn to Russia. At the same time, people who were worried that the United States was being too soft on Turkey made the opposite argument. If we keep letting Erdogan get away with everything, he's just going to get closer and closer to Russia. We need to do things like, get tough, impose sanctions to prevent this turn east. So, most concretely, when Turkey last summer finally went ahead and purchased S-400 missiles as a new air defense system over the objections of the United States government, according to CATSA, the sanctions policy that was imposed in 2016, this should have required congressional sanctions against any country that purchases Russian military equipment. You simultaneously had people saying it was good that the US government didn't impose these sanctions because that prevented a breakdown in US-Turkish relations and a Turkish pivot to Russia, and people saying that if the United States had been stricter in imposing these sanctions, it would have prevented Turkey from buying Russian weapons in the first place and making what they now worry is an ongoing pivot to Russia. So I guess I'm convinced that any good narrative is malleable enough that it can be used to advance anyone's agenda. And if you have an agenda you want to advance, I'd be happy to talk about how we can make this narrative work for you.
Okay, great. So, you want it more nuanced, but not necessarily in the service of any particular goals. Gotcha.
I'm just offering this nuance in the service of my getting a fellowship to write a paper that tries to explain this nuance. That's the much more short-term objective behind all of this. Okay, great.
That's a very, very specific agenda, but that's great. So we have a question from a CLI student, Maria Drozdek. And she wants to know if you have any insight on how Turkish-Russian relations impact the Balkans. And I'm assuming this is in the present tense, right? Because there's a history of impact on the Balkans, but at the moment.
Right, yeah. Historically, they've had a lot of impact on the Balkans. Why the Balkans are not part of the Ottoman Empire anymore. No, I mean, in the present day, honestly, I don't have a great answer to that. I mean, you read articles about, again, it's interesting, right? You read articles from the US and European point of view that either present Turkey as a potential counterweight to the supposedly nefarious spread of Russian influence in the Balkans, or alternatively present both Turkey and Russia as working in parallel and nefarious ways to undermine European and American influence in the Balkans. And I would defer to people with more expertise on which one of those is the case. I mean, you've certainly seen Turkey eager to try to find friends in the Balkans. You've certainly, on a specific issue, seen Turkey intervene. I guess you've seen Turkey intervene in the Balkans in ways that, from the EU's point of view, are not necessarily conducive to the spread of democracy and European values, in the same way that I think there are similar concerns about Russia. I think Russia has much more influence in the Balkans than Turkey does, regardless of what Turkey's aspirations are. People in the region see, I believe, Turkey as a convenient source of economic support, a good trading partner, and yet, and this is something that confronts Turkey in many of its dealings with Russia around the region. Turkey simply doesn't have the geopolitical heft that Russia does to make it relevant in the same way.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from another CLI student. This is from Hannah Pinard. And she asks, how have you seen Russo-Turkish relations changing or not more recently, after the fall of the Soviet Union, with the many tensions and wars in the Caucasus in the 90s and in the Caucasus in 2008, right, and then the later Russian invasions of Georgia and Ukraine. Does Turkey see those as a sort of relevant to its concerns about Russia?
Right, and I guess that's the other thing, not just with the Kurdish question, but with so many other regional issues. There was enough, I mean, I guess you say in part legacies of the Cold War, but in part new conflicts where Turkey and Russia consistently found themselves on the opposite side. And so as much as this historical legacy, it was also, right, it was these contemporary conflicts that kept Turkey's alignment with NATO very secure. And so, right, the invasion of Georgia was something that at the time really did worry Turkish policymakers. More concretely, the Armenia-Azerbaijan dispute, clearly something where Turkey was very firmly on Azerbaijan's side, Russia and Iran were on Armenia's side, and that created lingering tensions. What were the other, I mean, yeah, there are all sorts of examples. And then Syria, obviously, 2010, when the Syrian civil war starts, Turkey intervenes on the side of the opposition. Russia clearly comes in with Iran on the side of the Assad regime. This ultimately culminates with, once Russia gets directly involved in the conflict, Turkey actually shooting down a Russian airplane. People think this is going to be the spark for World War III. And in that context, I guess I would say it's all the more dramatic, not given the 200 years of history, but given the number of active sites of regional tension on which Russia and Turkey are on opposite sides, that they have been able to pursue the rapprochement that they have. And now Libya has been added to that mix, where Russia and Turkey are backing opposite sides of the Libyan civil war. And what's fascinating about this is that while it's clear Russia and Turkey are on opposite sides of all these issues, the Russian pitch, which Turkey's been very happy to go along with, is that Russian-Turkish cooperation can be a way to resolve all these conflicts and can be a way to resolve all these conflicts without the meddling of America and Western Europe. And there are two, well, I guess the trade-off or the contradiction from Turkey's point of view is, on one hand, this is very appealing to Turkey because they're elevated to the status of great power, dealing with Russia one-on-one in playing the dominant regional role that they aspire to, hashing out the future of Syria, hashing out the future of Libya. I've heard Russian diplomats make the case that once these two issues are solved, they'll move on to solve Ukraine, they'll move on to solve Nagorno-Karabakh together. So rhetorically, that's very appealing. The problem is that, again, in these negotiations, Russia ends up holding all the cards. And so the kind of agreement, as we've seen step by step taking place in Syria, that Turkey gets when it works with Russia to solve these conflicts, is one that always tends to reflect the interests of Russia and Russia's clients rather than Turkey and Turkey's clients. And I think what you've seen with Turkey as, since 2016, they've officially been involved in the Astana/Sochi process with Russia and Iran to resolve Syria. And they have a series of summits, they reach a series of ceasefires, most recently in March, and somehow everyone ends with the Syrian regime gaining more ground at the expense of Turkish-backed rebels. And what we saw last spring was a moment where it looked like maybe Turkey's patience with this was fed up. Turkey actually started sending troops that were directly fighting with the Syrian forces. Russia bombed Turkish troops, killed 30 Turkish soldiers. Turkey politely said it was Syrian warplanes that had done the bombing, not Russian warplanes. Then you saw the picture with Catherine the Great. Erdogan goes to Moscow, reaches a ceasefire where Russia and Syria are allowed to keep the gains that they've made. And then Turkey says, well, this is the last time we're going to let that happen. They send 10,000 more troops to Idlib, and no one knows what's going to happen next.
Okay, well, that was a really fascinating and nuanced response. And so just thematically, I think I have a question about the period that you talked about, the 1919 period to 1936, which you may have a similar response to there. This is also from Eugene Clay, because he's wondering about this period as a rapprochement. He says, this is a period when Enver Pasha betrayed the Soviets and supported the Basmachi, and when Turkey was welcoming refugees, notably Trotsky. Pan-Turkism during this period was probably a concern in the alphabet reforms, which for Turkic minorities, right, at that point gets switched from the Latin to the Cyrillic alphabets. How do you account for these apparently serious tensions between the USSR and Turkey during this period? Well, okay, so I don't do historical fact checking as I read these things, but Gary says that Enver Pasha was out of power by 1919 and dead by 1922. He was freelancing. This was not the Republic of Turkey.
No, and in a lot of ways it was, right, that was convenient. Ataturk was very eager to renounce some of the more aggressive policies that people like Enver Pasha had followed, and to present World War I as basically a mistake that the overeager Committee on Union and Progress, of whom Enver Pasha was one of the leaders, made in being overly hasty in allying with Germany, and then leading a rash and ill-thought-out fight against the Soviet Union, or again, then against Russia. Now I'm going to overcompensate and use the Soviet Union for everything. So right, I think Ataturk's eagerness to reject the kind of Enver Pasha's specific political associations and keep some of the hardcore pan-Turkists at arm's length actually made the rapprochement with the Soviet Union a lot easier. Precisely because Turkey had been through all these wars, precisely because Turkey was relieved to have held on to the territory that it had, it was, Ataturk in particular, was very eager to kind of make a new nationalism that, even as it played up the historic ties with Central Asia, made it clear that that wasn't what was driving contemporary Turkish foreign policy, and that that was not, you know, Turkish irredentism was not something that he had much patience for. There are undoubtedly people on this call who know far more about this than I do. I believe Irina is one of them. But there are actually some interesting parallels between some of the reforms that the Soviet Union was implementing in Central Asia and some of Ataturk's reforms. And so I'm trying to remember the exact country, but several Central Asian republics were given new Latin alphabets at the time, were they not? As part of the Soviet nationalities policy, before later being switched to Cyrillic.
Yeah, but that did happen, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I think Eugene's right that they switched to Cyrillic before 1936.
Okay, but initially, at least in the 20s.
Yeah.
There were anti-veiling campaigns in Central Asia the same way there were under Ataturk. The idea of creating a reformed Islam that, from both, I think, from the perspective of many conservatives in both the Soviet Union and Turkey, was seen as essentially atheism, was very much on the agenda of both the Soviet state and Ataturk. So yeah, there were surprising intellectual or ideological convergences there, in addition to the geopolitical ones. And it was easy, given how eager Turkey was to separate itself from the World War I past, it was easy to put some of the awkward stuff behind them as well.
I mean, I think that the point you made about the contemporary moment, right? It's quite awkward when the person that you're sitting at the negotiating table with, killed a bunch of your troops. So, but you can put that behind you by saying that it is Syrian warplanes, because other things seem more important. Okay, we have another few questions. This is also from one of our CLI students. This is from Mark Daniels. He's also in the Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian class, so we have these questions about the Balkans. He was wondering if you thought that, how the balance of power with Turkey, Turkey's balance of power in the region, whether this has impact on Western Balkan states' ascension to NATO and the EU, right? Because clearly, Turkey and Russia are on different sides there, at least. Well, hard to say about the EU these days, but certainly with NATO still nominally, at least, on opposite sides.
And that's, yeah, I realized I left out, I mean, Bosnia too was a huge issue on which Russia and Turkey were on separate sides. Both, especially for a lot of the Islamists in Turkey who were the predecessors, or in some cases the actual people who are now in power with Erdogan, but also for nationalists more generally. The Bosnian Muslim cause was something that they were very much emotionally engaged with. There were a lot of people in Turkey, both Bosnian refugees from the 1990s and also Bosnian refugees from a century earlier, who still had ties to that region. But right, so it's interesting with NATO, even as U.S. Turkish tensions frayed, Turkey was always eager to remain a member in good standing of NATO. And in part in the same way that the dynamic that took place during the Cold War, when Turkey felt like it could improve relations with the Soviet Union so long as it was part of NATO, I think that even now, in a much more fragile sense, remains, and that as long as Turkey knows it has the Article 5 guarantee, it feels like it can actually go much closer to Russia than it could otherwise. And at the end of the day, doesn't have to worry that Russian forces are going to invade Turkey, because as pissed as the United States might be at Erdogan, that would still be a red line as long as Turkey's in NATO. And so in that regard, I think Turkey was happy to go along with NATO expansion in the Balkans, and tried to play a constructive role in all that, and tried to present itself to NATO as a valuable partner in promoting that process. Especially, again, when Turkey's EU membership was on track, when the Balkans seemed like they were in the dream for the EU was to get Turkey and the Balkans all as part of the European Union, both in the NATO context and the EU context, that was somewhere where Turkey was happy to present itself as a useful partner to advance NATO-EU interests. Now that's all getting a lot more strained, but I think I'll stop there for lack of more concrete knowledge that would be pertinent to this. I guess the most recent, Macedonia's NATO membership, Macedonia, that was something Turkey was very excited about, because Macedonia is actually one of the countries that's been on better terms with Turkey. So that was also somewhere where everyone seemed to be in alignment.
Right, except for Russia.
Well, okay, yeah, everyone meaning Turkey and
yeah. Okay. Always good to know where to stop, but we do have a few more questions, and I see people are sticking around. I hope that's okay, Nick.
Fine.
Yeah. Okay, so John Castle, another student from the BCS class, they're coming up strong today. He asks, some see the US sanctions on Russia as making Putin more powerful and giving him more support within Russia. Do you believe sanctions are an effective method for the US to use, towards Erdogan and Turkey? Or do you this is actually, I'm interested in this as well, of course. Do you feel like US sanctions, like that Erdogan and the AKP have kind of spun US sanctions in a way that's actually given them more like a kind of a boost domestically, let's say?
Right, it's funny, in my experience, when you talk to people who work on Turkey, because the United States has not systematically sanctioned Turkey, there are a lot of people who are surprisingly optimistic that once we did, Turkey would fall into line and everything would turn out okay. People who worked on sanctions policy writ large, or other countries that the United States had sanctioned, were much less optimistic about this. And Russia seems like an excellent example of that. I've certainly heard people warn that if the United States did, the United States has briefly imposed sanctions on Turkey, which have already had the effect of weakening the Turkish currency and weakening the Turkish economy. So in some ways, this is already happening. The optimistic argument is because Turkey still is moderately or partially democratic, because Turkey still has elections. If enough damage was done to the Turkish economy, that would result in Erdogan losing. The flip side, as Irina alluded to, is that the economy was already probably going to be a disaster anyways. The more aggressively the United States sanctions Turkey, the easier it is for Erdogan to blame his economic difficulties on the United States. And then something that, again, I'm sure there are people here who can speak much better to in the Russian context, but that also the fear would be as the sources of legitimate income in Turkey dry up, as the ability of businessmen to make money engaging in international trade or through partnerships with foreign companies dry up. If anything, people will become even more, even as there's a smaller pie, people will become even more dependent on Erdogan and Erdogan's corrupt support and handouts and favors for their share of the pie. And I think, right, the risk is that that would end up consolidating Erdogan's regime.
Okay. Just a few more questions here. This is from our very own Dave Brokaw at the Melikian Center. He wants to know how are Turkey and Russia interacting during military patrols and exercises in the Black Sea? Are there interactions, or is there a kind of vying of control of the Black Sea?
No, I think it's still very much in the vying realm. I don't claim to be an expert on the Black Sea, but what I always hear people in DC who talk about this say, especially the ones who are still trying to find grounds for optimism, is that that's somewhere where the United States can continue to work with Turkey, and that's somewhere where Turkey has been eager to see NATO continue to play a prominent role. And that in connection with some of its both, some of the cultural concerns it has with the Russian takeover of Crimea, because of the history of the Crimean Tatars there, but also some of the concerns it has about its security in the Black Sea. Yeah, this is something that Turkey is concerned about, and this is something where it wants to see continued NATO engagement.
All right, so one more official question before we turn off the recording and chat until everyone's ready to leave. So this is also from Hannah. It is a question about Turkey's possible membership in the EU. Is it dead with warming relations with Russia? I mean, my question would be, is it dead even without warming relations with Russia?
I know, I was gonna say it was dead even before the warming relations. I mean, yeah. Turkey has better prospects than Russia does at this point.
For the EU, I don't think that Russia was thinking about that, but maybe you know better.
No, yeah, I mean, it's sad how that used to be such a big topic and such a source of concern, optimism, and now it's every once in a while, Turkey and its efforts to briefly repair its shattered relationship with Europe will say something about how the EU process is back on track, or Turkey remains committed to EU membership. And well, the most optimistic thing I've heard is that maintaining the legal status of Turkey as an aspiring EU member is something that people in the EU want to do because they think in 10 or 15 years, if the Turkish government changes, that will make it much easier to resume EU accession negotiations where they left off instead of having to start from scratch. And so it's this, at first I thought it was just this silly polite fiction that people maintained, but there's a kind of practical legal reason that if they ended negotiations now and Turkey became democratic all of a sudden and wanted to join and they needed to restart them, they could be vetoed by any number of European countries. That would be harder to do now as long as they were still in this kind of frozen moribund state. Okay,
so there's a kind of a utility to the frozen state.
That's a yes.
Okay, so I lied. It's not quite 3 p.m. yet, so we have one more question from the chat. This is from our CLI Macedonian alum who's also interested in possibly Turkey next summer, for Madison Good ballot. I'm gonna one of those. So with Turkey's invasion of northeastern Syria and purchase of Russian S-400 missile defense systems, what do you think the implications are for future strategic relations between the United States and Turkey? Of course, this is what you are commonly thinking and writing about, Nick. And while there are no mechanisms to expel a member from NATO, US policymakers have been kind of routinely questioning Turkey's membership, which I think you've also written about that as well.
Right, and so one of the concerns with NATO is what would happen if Turkey really started to try to use NATO as a forum within which to advance its interests and pursue some of its bilateral issues with the United States. And there's a risk that, whereas in the past, I think Turkey had succeeded in kind of keeping NATO on its side, or at least keeping NATO neutral in its argument with the United States, things like Syria, things like the purchase of the S-400s have created a situation where now everyone in NATO is frustrated with Turkey. And so, in the Syrian case, even more than, the Turkish operation invasion of northeastern Syria caused huge alarm in Washington. No one in Europe was happy with it. But from NATO's point of view, what was really alarming is when Turkey then held up NATO plans for the Baltics in order to get NATO to go along with defining the YPG, the Syrian group, the Syrian Kurdish group, as a terrorist threat, and pushing NATO to include language about the YPG as a threat in return for going along with something that everyone else in NATO thought should be automatic. And so things like that. Again, on the S-400s, you saw at first, I think the attitude of a lot of European countries was, this isn't that big a deal, let's just make it go away, we don't want to cause problems. And then as the kind of concrete concerns about what the S-400 missiles would mean for the security of the F-35 fighter jet became better known, all of a sudden you had other European countries siding with the United States and seeing Turkey as the problem. So yeah, in terms of how this will manifest itself, how long both sides will be able to paper over these issues, that I don't know. But it's definitely getting to the point where it's gone from being a U.S. Turkish problem to a NATO problem.
Well, I also wonder how member states of NATO are thinking about the U.S. problem too. So it's
right.
an interesting time in general for NATO. Okay, so we don't have any more questions in the chat, and we've reached the late hour of 3 or 6 p.m. for those of you on the, or 7 p.m. for those of you, no, 6 p.m. Sorry. For those of you on the East Coast. So I want to thank everyone again for coming to and actively participating in this event. I definitely want to thank Dr. Danforth for sharing his research and his expertise with us and for answering all of these thoughtful questions. So yeah, I've been giving people a round of applause.
Thank you.
I am still a camp counselor. But yeah, thank you so much, Nick, for making the time to talk with us today.